Since its introduction in 1932, the Patek Philippe Calatrava has set the standard for what a high-quality men's dress watch should look like, and every single dress watch that has come ever since, in some ways, was impacted by the monumental Calatrava. Today we're going to take a closer look at the evolution of Calatrava design over time, highlighting a number of key references and discussing what we can learn from each. We'll also discuss how Patek Philippe adapts design as it modernizes its collections and see the progression of DNA within the collection from the inaugural reference 96 all the way until the contemporary reference 6119. Let's get started. Although the name Calatrava was not officially associated with Patek Philippe watches until the later portion of the 20th century. The unofficial first Calatrava was the reference 96, launched in 1932. The same year, the Stern family acquired a majority position of Patek Philippe and officially took control of the firm. And in many respects, the reference 96 reflects the changes that the Stern family was intending to make to Patek Philippe as a whole. Not only was the 96 a monumental and impactful reference for Patek Philippe, it also was the first reference to be serially identified with a specific number. Today, if someone were to look at the reference 96, they'd probably describe it as a boring dress watch. But what you have to keep in mind is that in 1932, it was perceived as an incredibly contemporary watch. The look of a round dress piece was not something associated with Patek Philippe prior to the Calatrava reference 96. It had a very simple dial, slab-sided case, thick, sharp lugs, and a very simple aesthetic, which was reflective of the Bauhaus philosophy that was permeating throughout many, many areas of design, not only in the watch space. The 96 has earned the right to be a boring dress watch because it truly is the watch that created that look. And as we look through the later references that we've brought today, you'll see that this same design priority carries through all of the references that we have available today. So the reference 96, when it was first released, was considered extremely contemporary at 31 millimeters, which was actually larger than most watches released at the time, and with its flat bezel, very non-decorative style. It was a minimalist design, but it was incredibly elegant, and that was part of what made this watch so successful. Now, at the time, in 1930s, wristwatches were not yet extremely popular. World War I had started to demonstrate to people that a wristwatch actually had a place in the day-to-day because of its convenience and comfort. And people started to look at a wristwatch as something that they could wear as a fashion accessory in addition to telling the time. But it was still not widely accepted. And for the Stern family to invest in the development of reference 96 early on in their ownership of Patek Philippe, it was making a statement about where Patek Philippe was headed in the years to come. Many wristwatches during the 1930s featured soldered lugs. You'd essentially build a case to house a movement and then solder the lugs on as an afterthought. With the Calatrava, one of the key design choices that the Sterns made was to ensure that the watch actually had a single monoblock case carrying straight through from mid-case into the lug. And this created a flowing aesthetic that today is often referred to as the Calatrava case. And we see many, many makers, like F.P. Journe, for example, that use what are considered Calatrava-style cases. And this, I think, demonstrates once again that design details that today we just take for granted and see on hundreds of watches are actually the direct byproduct of Patek Philippe's careful decision-making process in the 1930s. While Patek Philippe released a variety of references between 1930s and 1980s, for the purposes of this review, I'd like to talk about a number of very specific milestone references, the next being the reference 3919, released in 1985. While the 3919 has a number of different stylistic choices made on this piece than the reference 96, we do see some of the similar DNA carrying through. We have an extremely simple, elegant layout. There's not a lot of excessive flashiness associated with this piece. It's again about form following function, simplicity above all else, and that is what made the Calatrava such a timeless design. Unlike the reference 96, the reference 3919 had soldered on lugs. In other words, the case was constructed, the movement was set in the case, and then these almost wire-like lugs that were sticking straight off the case are soldered on afterwards. It also makes the watch wear slightly differently. But the story of the 3919, I think, is also extremely telling about the significance of the Calatrava. In the 1980s, Patek Philippe was still adjusting to the quartz crisis and determining what course it would take in a post-quartz crisis watch market. So they enlisted the help of an ad agency to help them define what their values were going to look like. Specifically, they asked for assistance from a man by the name of René Bittel. René Bittel was brought in to essentially define what Patek Philippe would look like. What was the classic style of Patek Philippe? And Bittel said that what Patek Philippe would need going forward was to come out with one watch that would represent the Patek Philippe design approach, so that anyone that would look at it would say, that is a Patek Philippe, and know specifically that what they were looking at was something emblematic. And when Philippe Stern, the president of Patek Philippe at the time, asked Bittel, what do you think the ultimate Patek Philippe looks like? Bittel went and allegedly drew a sketch of the reference 3919. So what began as really a marketing strategy was actually a carefully thought out assessment of what the classic style of Patek Philippe was. And so in many respects, Bittel looked back at the blueprint of the 96, the components that had made that design successful, and reflected that in the 3919. Another key design feature included in 3919 was the hobnail bezel. While many people wrongfully assume that the hobnail emerged on the 3919, in actuality in 1934 there was a reference 96 which included the hobnail design, but essentially it's a engine turn pattern that creates an almost like pyramid effect on the bezel, and it allows the bezel to catch the light in a lot of different angles. And that makes for a very eye-catching look on what is otherwise a relatively reserved watch design. The 3919 was also known as the banker's watch because pretty much anyone successful in the 1980s and 90s wanted to have a 3919. And if you were to walk down trading floors at major banks in New York, this would be the watch that you would see on the wrist of anyone who was anyone. Patek Philippe had transcended just the watch industry and broken into broader culture as the symbol of what an elegant dress watch should look like. We next move to the reference 5196, which launched in 2004. This watch, in many respects, goes back to the reference 96, which is why you'll notice that the reference 5196 has the 96 included in it. And it was essentially a scaled up version of the reference 96 with a couple of other changes. A very similar dial layout with the subsidiary seconds, the coin edge bezel, all of the features that made the 96 so successful. And yet, this was designed for a modern customer at 37 millimeters as opposed to the 31 millimeters of the original reference 96. And what we see again across these last three references, the 96, the 3919, and the 5196, is that across it all, Patek Philippe has really kept anything excessive off of the watch. So whenever anyone would look at any of these watches, they would know immediately that they're holding something special, because the quality of the watch speaks for itself. And that was kind of the idea of Bauhaus design and the idea of the Calatrava. As we move on, we next hit the reference 5119, which was released in 2007. And the 5119 is a scaled up version of the 3919. Again, we have the similar lug structure, we have similar hobnail bezel that we've come to know and love. We even have the same movement, the caliber 215 PS, which on the 5119 now was visible through a sapphire exhibition caseback, unlike on the previous reference 3919. So 3919 measured 33 millimeters, which is pretty much a classic dress watch sizing. This was 36 millimeters. And 36 millimeters is probably a pretty good contemporary dress watch size. It's not quite as large as a sports watch at 40, 42 millimeters, but it's still a relatively timeless sizing. This is similar to, say, a Rolex Datejust. So 36 millimeters works really well for men and women. And when Patek Philippe released the 5119, it was wildly successful because it maintained that classic design that we've come to know and love from Patek Philippe, but it brought it to a more modern clientele. As we move along now to 2021, we get to the reference 6119. This watch has many of the details that we've outlined on our previous references throughout the evolution of the Calatrava, and it's all merged into one watch, which is what makes the 6119 in many respects a tribute to the history of the Calatrava, which, as we said, is the iconic dress watch for men. First of all, we see the flowing case profile and the seamless integration between mid-case and lug that we saw in the reference 96 and then continued onto the reference 5196. That DNA is continued straight through from 1932 all the way until 2021. However, we also see the hobnail bezel that we've come to know and love from the reference 3919 that was then in turn reflected in the 5119. The case diameter grew once again to 39 millimeters. And this again reflects consumer tastes changing as we move into the 21st century, and collectors are looking for almost a sportier dress watch look. And so the 6119 has been tremendously successful, largely because it built upon those core DNA attributes that the older references had and brought them to a new customer. The other thing that we saw on the 6119 was a brand new movement. This is the caliber 30-255 PS, which was developed specifically for this reference. And you know when Patek Philippe designs a movement specifically for one watch, that they consider that watch to be particularly important. This is a manually wound watch with 65 hours of power reserve, fueled from 2 barrels. And it's really nice to see that Patek Philippe is investing in manually wound movements. Today, it's no surprise to see that automatic movements are significantly more common on new watches than manually wound movements. And so to see Patek Philippe come out with a brand new watch in 2021 with a manually wound caliber, I think speaks volumes about where Patek Philippe's focus is, and once again demonstrates the history and heritage the brand has with manually wound dress watches. As we zoom out and look at the full Calatrava collection over the years, I think we gain an appreciation of just how significant the reference is. In each and every era, the Calatrava was, in many respects, the watch that people would look to as the classic dress piece. And so no matter what era Patek Philippe is in, they adapt their design to appeal to the tastes and preferences of that period while maintaining the classicism that allowed the Calatrava to be successful in the first place. Watches like the Calatrava are not only fantastic from a watchmaking standpoint, but they were also incredibly impactful on the design side. That's not something that many watch brands can really claim. Patek understands more than just watchmaking. They understand how to create successful and enduring designs. And in the case of the Calatrava, Patek Philippe really defined the entire market segment. To learn more about the full evolution of the Calatrava and each of these individual references, be sure to head to our accompanying transmissions article on analogshift.com. Additionally, if you'd like to explore our full range of Calatravas, including many of the ones that we have on the table, head to analogshift.com and take a look at all of our Patek Philippe offerings. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon below this video so that you can stay up to date with all the exciting content we have coming.